back and let me continue with the conclusions of the discussion we had. We just mentioned that the first item on the agenda should be convening a constitutional convention to reframe the constitution, reflecting more progressive participatory democracy. And I didn't explain the element of participatory. We have problems with concepts such as the Electoral College, which is back from the 1700s. Do we really need it? I don't think so. We do not have in our Constitution popular election for the president. The president should be elected through a popular vote like everywhere else. The countries that we have become model for in our political system are in some respects getting ahead of us because we are still working through a system that I think has become obsolete in the sense of having the Electoral College and winner-take-all elements and several other serious problems in our democracy, where those who run for government, especially for the high office of the President of the United States, they are concerned with a few what they call key states, and the rest of us are taken for granted because we don't have a popular vote. And all they are interested, and as they should be because the system calls for it, is to have the right number of electoral votes from the various states, especially the key states. I think we could have popular elections for the president, and we can get rid of the Electoral College altogether. And the next item that I'm suggesting is that to raise the winning threshold for incumbent candidates progressively in each subsequent election in order to level the field in competitive elections. Let me explain that. We just talked about how incumbency is a problem. In the American government system, they also talk about how term limits should be instituted so that incumbency can be taken care of. The proposal that I have takes care of both in a very fair way, because both term limits and incumbency are the two sides of the same coin. It's one and the same problem. If we are electing officers to the U.S. Congress on the basis of simple majority, which in principle is okay, then we are not accounting for the difference in respect to incumbency. And my suggestion is that we should revise that. If we have two candidates who are running as non-incumbents, say for the first time, if there is a vacancy and there are candidates from various parties, whoever wins the majority should be elected. That makes sense. However, if one of the people who's running for the office is an incumbent, my suggestion is that we should raise the winning threshold for the incumbent progressively. Like the first time, that candidate must win by at least 5 additional percentage points, not a simple majority. The second time around, it could be 10 percentage points. The third time, 15 percentage points, and so on. Or that the winning threshold for an incumbent should be no less than 50%, and then eventually 55, 60, 65, and let's see, perhaps it should be maxed at 75%. So if an incumbent can win an election or a re-election by, say, 75%, then he or she must have done a good job, such a good job that such a great majority has voted them in. And of course, they will be deserving that. And in this case, the other advantage is that if the person has good skills as a politician who serves the community, then he should not be termed out of office, and that the community, the citizens, the constituents should not be denied the service of a person who does so well. So therefore, if we change the simple majority winning to a winning the threshold for incumbent candidates to be an increasing one, a progressively increasing number, as I explained, either minimum 50% and subsequently 55, 60, 65 up to 75%, or by an additional 5% regardless of how the race, the numbers are divided up. That could make the democracy more representative. Another recommendation is, or conclusion rather, of our discussion is to update the political process to accommodate direct democracy via social media. We used to have elections that were conducted in an environment where this luxury at the time was, in a sense, a burdensome task for people to go to the ballot box from a generally rural America to counties and cities that were miles away, that took them away from their daily life of being engaged in agriculture. That was one of the reasons that election was to be held in November, which is after the harvest, because most Americans were farmers. And that was the reason that it was to be held on a Tuesday, the first Tuesday after the first Monday. It's a little technical, but if the first Tuesday was if Tuesday was the first of the month, then people may not have remembered because they were not so calendar conscious at the time. But the first Monday, the first Tuesday after the first Monday. So regardless, the point there is that the November election had to do with harvest, because the majority of Americans were engaged in farming. Now, in the 21st century, less than 3% of the American population is directly engaged in farming. Will that make any difference? The other element was that no, it could not be held on a Sunday because people were very religious and they wanted to leave that day for their religious service or whatever else they may have wanted to do. In some countries like Australia, if you don't, voting is required and not voting is considered a crime. You will go to jail if you didn't vote. In the American election, in a lot of cases, people have a lot of they are not really motivated to go to the ballot boxes, partly because of this incumbency element, partly because of their frustration in not being able to change anything really meaningfully to affect the lives of the people. And so therefore I'm suggesting that we could use the social media. And yes, there are people who are uneasy about it because of what happened in the year 2000. But that in itself cannot be the reason, because we could improve upon it. We have digitized a lot of our other data collecting systems in the country. Why not election? I'm even thinking that we could probably even use that system that would have to be perfected and would have to have a lot of security mechanisms installed in them, so that eventually we could use a lot of referenda. Many of the decisions that the Congress make could be relegated to the public, referred to the public, and therefore becoming referendum or referenda. That could be that could speed up a whole lot of this legislation process. Again, I'm introducing the concept, but in order to operationalize that, to make it doable and acceptable, a constitutional convention will have to undertake that task. Establish term limits via progressive winning vote requirements, which I think could be done with the raising the threshold that I already discussed. Now, from the discussion of several of these concepts, I think there is an implied reference to what I would call to subject any war-related decision to a minimum 2/3 majority vote of the citizens. Let me repeat that one more time. That to subject any war-related decision. Remember, we are talking about why are we so engaged in war, and yet we idealize peace. So in order to make that change, a reorientation from a war-footed economy and a warmongering, perhaps, a war-centered political system to a peace-centered, one of the ways would have to be that any war-related decision in the U.S. government and primarily in the U.S. Congress has to be done on the basis of a 2/3 majority vote. Again, either of the citizens or that of the Congress. And I would personally prefer it the citizens, because it's often the Congress that votes for a war, but it's the citizens who put their lives online. In other words, the average citizen pays with their life, with their blood, for a decision that a congressperson makes. And in most cases, I'm assuming, and I hope this assumption is not too far off, that in most cases, the people who vote for war themselves either do not participate directly, and in many cases, even their children don't. And yes, of course, there are exceptions. And there are cases where those who are more bent on war are the ones who run away from war when it was their turn to serve their country. We talked about the chicken hawks were the ones who were participants in the New American Century, the neocons, who took the country to a war, and we are still stuck in that war. But they themselves, when it was their turn to serve the country, they basically went the other way. They dodged the draft, if not literally, at least in a politically manipulated way. We have to define the accountability of the national leadership at the global level. Like I said earlier, the very few cases where we have had, just like in the Nuremberg trials or at the International Criminal Court, where certain leaders of generally third world countries, and a few in case of former Yugoslavia, were brought to justice. And that is not applied uniformly to European and North American leaders. And the reason this is critical is that it's because it's the decision of the European and North American leaders that is who are responsible for more of these wars. And I'm thinking that yes, you can bring some Africans and Asians and Latin American leaders to that court, but let's not making it a kangaroo court of sorts for the international consumption, that there is an accountability, but only for some. And the way we see it, at least in the American political process, is that I think starting with the Reagan administration, or perhaps earlier, that every American president had to engage in some kind of a foreign adventurism, military adventurism, an invasion of Grenada here and an invasion of Iraq there and so on, so that they can prove to the American citizens that they are quote unquote strong on defense. And that very term of being strong on defense should be turned into strong on peace, which hasn't caught up with the American political psyche at this point, but it's time to do so. So that the people of another country have to pay the price of dying under invasion, an attack, or some sort of military operation, whether it's in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, and the list goes on, Libya, so that the American president would look good. By good, I mean quote unquote strong on defense, so that they can be elected or re-elected. The people of the third world have to pay the price. That's how they are now. They shouldn't. I'm also suggesting that we revise the Geneva Conventions to enshrine human rights and human dignity without cultural relativism in its new provisions. This has to do with the general concept of cultural relativism that I think I've been alluding to in an indirect way, is that we should apply the laws of the international bodies uniformly to all leaders around the world, and if we are to accept certain principles, such as those of the Geneva Conventions, for example, to respect the sovereignty of a nation. And if sovereignty has to amount to aerial space, to the borders, or to its citizens, that has to be applied uniformly, and unfortunately that is not the case. We can come back to that discussion with a little more details, that the way things are now is that we have used or applied the Geneva Conventions selectively. Take, for instance, the element of warrior combatants, which was a cop-out, which was going around the Geneva Conventions by the Bush administration, Donald Rumsfeld and others, that they were ducking their responsibility, that the Geneva Conventions called for treating the prisoners of war with dignity. It did not say whether they were wearing uniforms or not. It did not say whether they were from a quote-unquote failed state or not. A prisoner of war is a prisoner of war. War is fought between nations. It's not a skirmish between individuals. So if war is fought between nations, the citizens of those nations who engage under whatever circumstance, when they are held, captured by the other party as prisoners of war, they should be treated as prisoners of war. And that was violated in the case of the US invasion and engagement in Afghanistan. That when they captured the prisoners, or when they captured whomever they wanted to, because there was another human right violated, and that was that the US military promised to pay cash for turning in anyone suspected of being anti-US. And there were people who were engaged in humanitarian assistance in refugee camps, but they were Arabs. But that Arab identity was enough for them to be captured, because the ones who pointed to them would be getting $50,000 or a large sum of money that they could not even dream of getting otherwise. So a lot of innocent people were brought. And again, the Geneva Conventions were violated by creating the Guantanamo prison, where every principle against which the American political system campaigned for years, and I'm talking about torture, that the Americans often accused the KGB of the former Soviet Union and the intelligence services of other countries of engaging in torture in violation of the principles of human rights. We resorted to them, unfortunately. So the very thing that we have been campaigning against during the Cold War for 70 years, when we showed the world and we told the world that we are better, that we are not evil like the quote-unquote the evil empire, that we have dignity, that we have humanity, that we adhere to the Geneva Convention. Those are the ones we violated, and therefore we became worse than our enemies of the Cold War through our actions. And so it is not just the question of the cultural relativism. Yes, that too. But it is the way we treated the world like they did not matter because they were from a different culture. So we heard just this morning that another 15 prisoners from the Guantanamo prison have been released, who have been held for more than 14 years, where nothing was filed against them. They were not held for any crime they had committed. For no crime committed, you hold a person for 14 years without any investigation, without any evidence, without proving anything, but subjecting them to all forms of torture. That is not what the American Republic was built on. That is something we ought to be ashamed of, because the founding fathers of America advocated a different system, a very, very different system. That's the responsibility of every American, to revise and rethink the principles that define American democracy. We are violating it at every turn. Human dignity in the 21st century has become a relative term. Only we have it. Only when our people are captured as prisoners, we demand of other nations, but we do not reciprocate. That is not the way to symbolize democracy, to idealize democracy, to claim to be the beacon of democracy. It's in action. It's not in words. And the human rights, again, becomes another convenient tool in the hands of those who can manipulate political situations. Where are the human rights of the people who are held in the Guantanamo prison for no crime of their own? Yes, there must have been some, but they were under the control of the United States. And just because the territory is in Cuba, that shouldn't deny them their day in court. This in itself shows our weakness, the weakness of our system, that we were not ready to face them in a court and bring a case against them to show what their crime was. What crimes have they committed, so that they can pay a price for a crime and become a symbol for others who would in their turn stay away from committing such crimes in the future. Most of these were people whose crime was their identity and whose crimes were being at the wrong time, in the wrong place, and falling into the wrong hands for money, for power, or for medals. That is shameful. We may not want to admit it, but truth is not always easy to hear. You have to be brave enough to listen to truth. We could also talk about pursuing the fundamental reform, the recognition and the democratization of the United Nations to reflect a fair and a balanced representation of the different regions of the world. That is a mouthful, I know. And we can discuss this further. And this has nothing to do with the United States internal politics, but it has to do everything with the role the United States plays as the major power and as the signatory of the United Nations Charter in San Francisco, 1946. And so therefore we are responsible for rectifying that, for correcting that, and for making it more democratic. So let's take a short break and we will be back to discuss that.